I cannot fake authenticity. Like, what I've written is like, it feels crazy to say this, but I'm in Japan. Hi, I'm in Japan. So I thought it would be a perfect time to talk about J-horror and talk about why we have collectively agreed that it's elite and whether or not it's actually deserving of that reputation. And this is not going to be the world's deepest dive, so be warned that if you're stealing this info to write a college essay, you will probably not get an A. So J-horror obviously refers to Japanese films that fall within the genre of horror, and there'll be a few recognizable titles that'll come to mind for most of us. Even people that aren't big fans of horror will recognize the likes of Ju-on the Grudge and Ringu because of their American remakes, The Grudge and The Ring. And then there are other recognizable Japanese horror films like Houseu, Battle Royale, One Missed Call, and Audition. And these are all great films, arguably the best known J-horror films because of two reasons. Either their critical success within Japan that meant attentive Western film fans that were paying attention to what was popular in Asia decided to give them a watch, or because their commercial success drove Western producers who were chasing that bag to make their own American remakes. Either way, the heights of J-horror made their way to a wider global audience and became beloved films for genre fans, as J-horror is generally considered to differ in tone and quality from Western and particularly American horror films. All of this considered, Japan is viewed by many people in the world as the country that makes the best horror films. I was prompted to write this video when I saw a community post by horror YouTuber CZ's World polling the question, who makes better horror, America or Japan? The poll skewed a pretty drastic 63% to Japan and only 37% for America, which you'd think is a pretty definitive answer. But CZ's World is an American English language channel. And this is a guess, but I would assume that the majority of the audience is American or English speaking based on these factors. I.e., we're not asking an audience that's majority or even equal in Japanese members, and therefore the answer to the poll is skewed by Western opinion. I would love to see the same poll done on a Japanese account to see how those results differ. And I actually don't know of any Japanese horror channels, so if anybody does know of them, please comment. There was plenty of healthy debate on CZ's poll, but one comment really stood out to me. Japanese horror also has an advantage in the Western world because it has an added layer of cultural confusion that we don't understand as intuitively as if it were our own. And this brings us to the main question. Is J-horror really deserving of this esteem, or do we just not understand it? Okay, we're obviously not in Japan anymore, but stay tuned. To start with, let's look at what makes a J-horror outside of being made in Japan. One of the most common characteristics is the inclusion of the supernatural, notably yurei. Yurei, which translates to faint spirit, are figures in Japanese folklore equivalent to ghosts in Western culture. And specifically, ghosts or spirits that are prevented from experiencing a peaceful afterlife as a normal spirit, a reikon, would. The reason for a yurei's unrest is most likely because of a sudden or violent death, like a suicide or murder, or because of an intense sense of love, sorrow, hate, or a desire for revenge at the time of their death. In these circumstances, a reikon is transformed into a yurei and able to connect to or remain in the physical world. And to be exorcised from their perpetual unrest, a yurei must resolve their emotional conflict, fulfill its purpose in the living world, or complete any rituals such as last rites that were missed. And there are lots of types of yurei, given that they're the equivalent of ghosts. Not all of them are vengeful. Artist Maruyama Okyo created the first known example of the now traditional yurei look in his painting The Ghost of Oyuki, which set a standard look for yurei in Japanese culture. This look is immediately recognizable if you're familiar with the early 2000s remake era. White clothes, as burial kimonos are commonly white, pale skin, long black disheveled hair. Traditionally, they don't have feet and they just float around, although presumably because of special effects budgets at the time, this didn't really translate to the popular J-horror films. Yurei are core influences of J-horror, appearing in films like the Ju-on series, the Ringu series, Kwaidan, Apartment 303, Dark Water, and many, many more films. But yurei and hauntings aside, J-horror also puts a focus on family life or a dissolving family, psychological horror and tension, and many of the early Japanese horror films draw from traditional kabuki and no theatre. In my opinion, one of the scariest aspects of J-horror is the randomness. Protagonists don't always seem to earn or deserve their fate as they do in Western horror. We're used to seeing teens murdered for being sluts or bullies, or mistakes from somebody's past come back to haunt them. Often Western media's focus is on teaching its audience a lesson about deviance or bad behaviour, or to operate as a warning. But it's the random undeservedness of the horror experienced by the protagonists of J-horrors that makes it so unnerving and truly horrific. Some recent Western horrors have definitely latched on to this idea as a source of anxiety in its viewers. I know I talk about it literally all of the time, but Hereditary is a great example of this. I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see more of this in Western horror, as it's become somewhat reflective of the way of the world. Cruelty feels random and unjustified, and we no longer have such clear lines of morality. And obviously, while some of the most famous films do, not all Japanese horrors are going to revolve around these elements. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, is a cyber body horror spectacle. Audition is a slow burn revenge film. Ichi the Killer is a sadistic serial killer romp. If you have not seen Ichi the Killer, it's literally one of the most fucked up films I've ever seen. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was not that. Speaking of the last two, I do not trust that man. Takashi Miike? Miike? Are you okay, Takashi? Because it doesn't seem like it. So there's an argument, as raised by our commenting friend, that the cultural differences between the West and Asia contributes to our high praise of Japanese horror films. From the baseline of not understanding the language to specific cultural divides regarding religion, lifestyle, and rituals, there is a disconnect with Western audiences. We don't see ourselves reflected, which can create both unease and intrigue. And I'd say this goes for foreign films in general, no matter what foreign is to you. And these points of cultural disconnect might be the tipping point that convinces an audience member that a film is more frightening than it would be if it was set in their own language or culture. People love to say that Ringu is superior to its American remake, The Ring. But why? I don't think it just comes down to quality, because Gore Verbinski's Ring is fantastic. But as an English language speaker watching Ringu, there's an immediate barrier created by the inability to process the language that I think causes people to attribute a certain level of esteem to the Japanese version. And don't get me wrong, I love Ringu. It is brilliant. I just think they're both brilliant. Similarly, yurei, which we discussed before, are different from the American perception of ghosts. The stark appearance of the vengeful yurei is far from the wispy Western ghosts that we're used to. Ultimately, I think this comes down to the natural human interpretation that something that is different is scary. Fear of the unknown is a commonly understood concept. We get freaked out by we're not used to and are unnerved by things we don't understand. Culturally, this idea can extend as far as xenophobia. And while I don't think this is problematic in the context of cinema, I do think it has a subtle effect on the Western dread upon watching Japanese horror. I think we can recognize the legitimacy in this as we see Western directors frequently use foreign mystique to their advantage. One of the most famous examples being Eli Roth's Hostel. It's an American horror that relies on the Slovakian setting to alienate the characters and audience to create an eerie and confusing atmosphere. I just recorded this whole section and my microphone wasn't on. Exposure also likely plays a part in the general sentiment that Japanese horror rules. I don't mean rules as in that rules. I mean whatever. Basically, we see a small amount of the total films made in Japan, because only the most successful films will make it from Japan to the West. These films, already guaranteed to be good given their commercial or critical success at home, enter the Western cultural curriculum and are watched world over. But when you start looking below the surface, the JHorror Iceberg, if you will. There are plenty of Japanese horror films that involve the same jump scares, low production values, and terrible acting that we tend to associate with American horror. There's Chichibu Demon, Carved, The Slit-Mouthed Woman, Shirome, Cult, and Yogun. Endless entries into the world of film that do not live up to the heights of Ringu or Ju-on. Streaming affects this slightly because we don't rely on cinemas and DVD releases to watch films these days, but if a film doesn't create a positive buzz, it's unlikely that even with the World Wide Web at our fingertips that we're going to come across it, let alone actively seek it out. And obviously some people will. There are always going to be people seeking out every dark corner of the internet. Anything you want to find, you can find. But we're talking general horror audiences here. Ultimately, this leads us to base our overall opinions of J-horror on the best of the best. I swear there is a statistical name for this, but I very much failed maths. Skewed chart? Biased? Selection bias? Maybe? Point is, there might be lots of rubbish ones, we're just not seeing them. And to make that worse, what we do see are the hundreds of terrible American horrors because they're more accessible both physically and psychologically to Western audiences. Many of us have seen the entire spectrum of American horror, from the best to the worst to the painfully average and completely baffling. We can access them on Netflix or in cinemas, so naturally they become central to our discussion of film. So, of course, as an English-speaking Westerner, when you compare the 4 exceptional Japanese horrors that you've seen to the mixed bag of American horror that you've consumed over a lifetime, American cinema probably isn't gonna look that good. At the end of the day, hundreds, if not thousands of films are released every day, and we as the audience are just hoping for the best to rise to the top so we can find them and see them. Like anywhere else in the world, Japanese horror may have some duds, but there's so much to praise when J-horror is at its best. Every Japanese horror I've watched has offered me something, and even if some of that excitement is built on mystique, at the end of the day my sentiment is the same. I just love watching it. It's fun to question and compare, but no culture has a monopoly on creativity because it starts with the individual. And this means every country has the potential to raise a brilliant mind who will one day make a brilliant film. But what is undebatable is whether it's the best of the genre or not, J-horror is 100% worth your time. I don't care how old you are, you will shit yourself the first time you see Sadako crawl out of that well.